All right. Welcome to today's webinar. The topic today is Windchill configuration management, and I am your host, Wade Moravec. Just a quick agenda. I'm going to do an introduction to boundary systems and then an overview of configuration and a demonstration, and then I will open it up for Q&A. And if you do have questions, you can ask them throughout the presentation. Everybody is muted right now, so I won't be able to hear you, but there is a question section that you can enter your questions into, and I'll be able to get to those as they come in. Just first, a little bit about me. Like I said, my name is Wade Moravec. I'm the Director of Engineering for Boundary Systems. I have over 17 years of experience with PTC products. Started out doing primarily pro engineer training, and then when Windchill was released in the mid-2000s, or at least when PDM Link came out, I got more and more involved on the PLM side with consulting, implementations, as well as training. Boundary Systems, we are a partner with PTC, so we do PTC certified training classes for both Creo and Windchill. We can also do Windchill implementations and support services. So if you need any help around PTC products, give us a shout. We're also partners with some other software companies that sort of have complementary products to the PTC offerings. Solid Thinking offers some higher-end simulation solutions, such as Inspire, which is sort of lightweighting software, where you can basically specify your requirements of a design, and it'll remove all except the required material to satisfy those requirements. We also work with eTraj for custom solutions that work with Creo and Windchill, and ZWCAD if you do 2D drawings. You just need a drawing solution. Boundary Systems, we have been around for a little over a decade now, again, working with PTC products. A lot of our engineers and sort of ownership of Boundary Systems has been working with PTC even longer than that. These are some of our awards and sort of acknowledgments here. Again, these are some of our partners that we work with. So, PTC is where sort of a lot of our focus is. But if you have things that sort of go beyond the standard PTC offerings and you have questions about those, we may be able to help you with those things as well. And here's our contact information. If you do have questions following the webinar, if you have technical questions, feel free to email me. If you have sales questions, you can just email sales@boundarysys.com. And if you want more information on configuration management, we do have that available on our website, just under products and then Windchill. There's a configuration management section. So diving into the the main content of today's webinar, we are going to talk about configuration management. And the first question comes up, what is configuration management? Well, configuration management is essentially the combination of product structure management, sort of managing the structure of your bill of materials, with change management. For this webinar, we're really going to focus on the product structure management side of configuration management. Change management, we'll mention it here and there, but that's a little bit more straightforward. We have Windchill comes out of the box with problem reports, change requests, and change notices. They have out-of-the-box workflows, and they can be tied into managing the lifecycle states and revisions of your components and assemblies and documents and all of those things. Product structure management can be a little bit more complex because there are several different types of product structure management that you can be interested in. So I have a couple of those examples outlined here on the slide. The first thing that you might be concerned with is changes to your bill of materials or your product structure over time. And there are several ways you can manage that within Windchill using bill of material filters, using baselines, using part configurations and part instances. And so, as you go through and you make changes, you sort of build a product, you release it, then you need to make changes, and then you release it again, then you may make some additional changes. You want to go back and see what did it look like at those exact moments in time. And so I'll show you a little bit about how you can do that. The next thing that we can look at is if you need different configurations of that product or different BOM structures for different departments. So for example, engineering goes in and builds an engineering BOM based on design intent and parent-child relationships and all of those things that are critical sort of on the CAD and the Creo side. But then when we go to pass that to manufacturing, they need to think about the order in which things are going to be assembled together, and that may differ from what we've captured in the EBOM. So we need a manufacturing bill of materials. When we go to purchasing, they may need to purchase all of specific types of components grouped together into kits, and so they may need a purchasing BOM that's different from the EBOM or the MBOM. And so we can capture that using view versions and also using NPM link BOM management, which I'll talk a little bit about. And finally, we just have the option of configurable products. So, okay, we have a standard sort of product line, and then within that, people can pick and choose different options, and we want to build a configurable product based on that. So it's basically, build to order or engineered to order type of things, and we can also do that in PDM Link with the options and variants. So we're not going to go into a ton of depth on any of these, but I do want to go through and sort of give you a good overview of all of these, because the first thing that you need to do when you start thinking about using Windchill for configuration management and product structure management is you need to think about, well, what do we mean by that? What type of configuration management are we trying to do? How do we want to use the system? And then we can determine what tools are best utilized to do that. So, again, the general idea of product structure management is we're building a complete digital representation of the product. So, we can have our MCAD, we may have ECAD, we may have software, we may have additional documents that go along with that. And building as you can see on the right, we have an example of a product structure. And each of these items in our bill of materials is going to be represented by a part object that can be tied to, our CAD model, can be tied to data sheets, it can be tied to requirements documents, and so that allows us to sort of build up a full definition of that object. The key is those part objects, the gray gear here, act as those hubs that are the definition of each of the items that are going to go into this BOM or into this product structure, and then we can use the tools available within Windchill PDM Link to manage the structure of those parts. And one of the most common ways that we want to manage the structure of those parts is to manage how that structure changes over time. And we can do that with filters. So you can see on the right here, I have an image of just some standard saved filters. So I can use my system default filter for my bill of materials, or I can use a latest released filter. And down below, you can see where I'm editing to create a new filter. And so that allows me to go in and tell it, I want to see this bill of materials or this product structure based on certain criteria that I'm going to go in and enter. One of the common criteria that you'd use is baselines. And so a baseline is essentially a snapshot of my product structure at a certain moment in time. One of the really common times that you want to create a baseline, so that you can get back to that, is when you release an assembly. So, okay, I go in, I build all my components, I make all my changes, I test everything, I make sure it's going to work. I do that initial release, and I want to create a baseline so I can always go back and see that structure exactly as it was when it was released. And there are two ways you can traditionally release things in Windchill. You can release through a promotion request, or you can release through a change notice. The promotion request actually creates a baseline automatically. So you have a filter called promotion request that you can go in and use to see how is this structured at that time. Or you can just manually create a baseline, which is how you would have to do it when releasing with a change notice. But this, again, allows you to go back and see exactly what your structure looked like when it was released. So before I go on, I'm going to actually jump into the demo here and show you an example of using filters to manage your product structure and viewing some baselines and things like that. So in Windchill, I'm going to go view a product structure. And so this is sort of a engine blower assembly. And you can see, if you look over at the structure on the left here, you can see the different versions that everything is at. So I'm going to go to my filters, and I'm going to go to my system default filter. I'm going to go to, and if I expand some of these out, I'm going to go to let's open up my engine assembly, and I'll just look at that in more detail. So you can see that my engine assembly is at Rev B, and then my different components, I have a couple of these at B, a couple at C, everything is currently released. If I go to my saved filters, and I go to my latest released configuration, I'm going to see, I still see everything because it's showing the latest released version of each of these components, and they're all released, so that's what it's going to show me. What I don't know is if these were the exact versions of everything that were there when Rev B of the engine was released. Maybe at some point I went in and I made changes to the piston assembly right here that I have highlighted. And maybe I made changes to that and I re-released that, and I didn't actually rev the top level assembly. Well, some people say you should always rev the assemblies where things are used, but a lot of times that's just because there's no other good way to manage that. In this case, if I really didn't make any changes to the main engine, but I did tweak something in the piston, and I want to reflect that we had the engine assembly as it was released, and now we have a newer version of that, I can do that with filters. And so I can go up to my engine assembly, and I can edit the filter that I'm using for that. And I can go in and tell it, all right, instead of a latest configuration, I want to use a baseline filter. And so it's going to show all of the baselines that were created that involve this assembly. And so I can select that baseline. It's got a name. It's a managed object within Windchill. I can search for it. I can see everything that relates to that baseline. And I'm going to update the filter. And when I apply that, now I'm going to see that actually that baseline captured everything at Rev A. And so this is an exact snapshot of this structure at the time that baseline was created. And so you can see some of these were actually still in work, so I don't have everything released within that particular baseline. So I'm going to go back, I'm going to change my filter back to latest release. And I want to create a new baseline that I'm going to be able to get back to here. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to, just from my part, I'm going to choose Actions, New. Oops. Actually, I'm going to choose, I just forget where they hide this. I'm going to choose Add to Baseline for my top level assembly. I'm going to tell it to create a new baseline. Call it Engine Rev B. And I'm going to tell it to go ahead and populate the baseline with all of the dependents in here as well. So it shows the primary item of the baseline. It shows everything else that was controlled in the baseline. And so now I've created this new baseline for this engine assembly. So now I could go in and take one of these components. Like I'm going to take my crankshaft and I'm going to revise that. And so now my crankshaft is at Rev C and it's in work. And then I'm going to, so right now, if I look at my filters, if I set my filter to system default, which is basically showing the latest of every object in there, regardless of its life cycle state. So it shows, that crankshaft is at Rev C and it's in work. If I change my filter to latest released, which is going to show the latest released version of each component, now it's going to go back to Rev B of my crankshaft, because that's the latest released version of that item. I can go in here and I can go ahead and I can go to my crankshaft, and I'm going to set the state of my crankshaft now. This is Rev C. I'm going to set that to release. And now I'm going to go back to my engine assembly. So here's my engine assembly again. And again, if I go through my different filters, right now I'm on my system default filter. So it's showing the latest version of everything regardless of life cycle state. And now the latest version of everything actually is released. So if I go to latest released, it's going to look exactly the same because Rev C of that crankshaft is now released. What if I go back and I do that baseline filter again? So I'm going to go to edit my filter. I'm going to go to my baseline. And now you can see I have two baselines available. I have my baseline that was created at Rev A of the engine assembly, and I have my baseline that was created at Rev B. I can also go in and tell it only show the baselines for the current revision if I want to. So I'm going to tell it show my engine Rev B baseline, update that filter, and now you can see it does go back and it shows, okay, the crankshaft was at Rev B when that baseline was taken. So again, that's one of the things that can cause problems is, okay, we released Rev B of this assembly. If we make changes to some of the lower level components and then we re-release those, when we go to our latest released configuration, it's going to show those latest versions. How do we go back and see what did this look like at the time, that my top level assembly was released? That's what a baseline does, just snapshots that specific point in time. One other thing with baselines and everything and filters, before we sort of move on to the next thing here, I have another product. Right here. So this part is at Rev I.1. So it's gone through a bunch of revisions, and it only has one component, and that component is at Rev O. But the one thing I can do here is if I go back and look at my history, the initial object, or Rev B, the initial release of that was done through a promotion request. And when you do a promotion request to release something, it actually automatically sort of creates a baseline. It creates a promotion request baseline. So in this case, if I go in and I edit the filter for this, you can see when I go back to Rev B, using the latest configuration, it still shows that Rev O is there because it doesn't know what was there when Rev B was created. It just shows the latest revision. So if I go to edit my filter, now I can go in and tell it use the promotion request filter, and it's going to show any promotion requests that are associated with all versions of the object or just the current version I'm looking at. So I'm going to pick 0001, apply that, hit OK, and now again it jumps back in time and shows me, with that particular configuration, I've got Rev B of the assembly and Rev A of this component. Now in this case, I've also released a bunch of other versions all the way up to I. So if I go to edit my filter and I choose baseline, you can see here are all of those different I configurations. And you can see I actually have two Rev C configurations. So I have Rev C 01 and Rev C 02. So If I look at revco1, you can see that used revc of the subcomponent. If I change it to revco2, and now we're at revd of that component. So that's an example of, okay, I have this minor change I need to make to a subcomponent somewhere down within this assembly. Do I need to revise the top level assembly so that I can see rev A use rev A of this component and rev B use rev B of the component? Well, not necessarily if you're using baselines to track those type of lower level changes. So I can have, rev A of the top level assembly, but then I can have baseline rev A01 and rev A02 that represent those different configurations. So that's how you use baselines. Again, if you want to create a baseline, at whatever point in time, you can select the item you want to baseline, and you just say add to baseline, and then you collect everything that's related that you want to add in there. A lot of times, like I said, promotion request automatically generates that promotion request sort of baseline. That's sort of a unique object type in itself that you can use. If you're using the change process, again, the change notice doesn't automatically do the same thing. So a lot of times what we'll do is just edit the change notice workflow, where once the change notice is approved and it releases all of those new objects or the new versions of the objects, it sends a task to one of the change administrators to go in and create that baseline. So they would go in, they'll create that baseline. Now you know you're always going to have that there. All right. So that was baselines. Again, pretty straightforward. You tell it you want to add it to a baseline, and it snapshots the structure at that particular time. I also mentioned that we can manage changes to a structure over time using part configurations and instances. This is a little more complex, and essentially, from a part, you can say create a new configuration. But the idea here is if you look at your structure that I have represented over on the right here, the diamonds represent an item master. So a part master is that object itself, and it manages all of the revisions and iterations of that object. So underneath each master, like this one right here, here's a master, and then we have 3 different versions of that. So those could be iterations or they could be revisions in there. It's all managed as a part of that master. What a part configuration does is it's similar to the baseline in that it snapshots that part at a specific point in time. So what we can do with this configuration is we get everything ready to go, and then we tell it, okay, we want to create an end item configuration. And so it's a new item called a configuration. We call it Series A in this case. And it captures the exact revision and version of everything that's in the structure at the time of that configuration. We can then continue making changes. So the next thing we do is we revise several of these objects. Maybe we add a new item in here. Maybe we create a new revision of an item. Again, we make those changes. We're still at Rev A of the top level item, but now we go in and we create another configuration. And so the idea here is we can sort of capture, as built versions of this structure. Okay, we go in, we start building these, we create an end item configuration to capture how it's built. At some point, we make changes to a couple of the components and we start building items, from that configuration, we can track those different configurations. So we make additional changes. Once we make those changes, we go in and we capture that configuration. So now we've got 3 different configurations of this same object. So why would we do this instead of baselines? Well, where the configurations and instances really starts to differentiate itself is when we get to the instances. So from each of these configurations, I can create an instance, and that instance is basically a serialized traceable object. So I have to define my part as traceable by serial number or lot number or something like that. And so now I can take Series B and say, okay, from this configuration, create an end item instance. and now I give it a specific serial number. And then I can create another instance and give that a serial number. And so if I want to track every instance of this product that I put out into the field, I can do that by creating this configuration. As we build individual instances of that configuration, I create instances in Windchill to reflect that. And then I have the ability, if I have individual serialized objects, you know, if some of these components need to be tracked by serial number because they're a critical component or something like that, you know, I can define, you know, an instance of that component, and I can incorporate that specific serial number of the component into the specific serial number of the higher level assembly. And then, you know, some of the things that I can do here is once I'm tracking things this way, if I go back and I decide, oh, I actually need to replace a component in one of these, you know, I can apply those changes specifically to that instance or to that configuration. You know, if I come into, you know, serial number 124 here, and it's got an issue, and while I'm fixing that issue, I say, you know what, I'm also going to replace some of these other components with the newer versions that we used in Series C. I can then make those changes and basically relink this specific instance to a different configuration. So again, sort of gets a lot more down into the weeds, so to speak, than what you get with the baselines. If you just want to see what versions were we at when we released this, so I can go back and look at that snapshot in time, you know, baseline gives you everything that you need to do there, and it's pretty easy to implement. If you need to get more detailed with exactly how you're tracking things, again, you know, track things by serial number or by lot number or things like that, then you can get into, you know, or part configurations and part instances. But they're both sort of looking at, again, how this is changing, you know, over time. The next way, so that was sort of looking at how things change over time. The next way we may want to look at, you know, product structure configuration or BOM configurations changing is looking at different ways that same structure needs to be viewed by different departments or for different purposes. So, you know, here's an example where, you know, as we're planning it, we may come up with a product structure based on our requirements. Then we may go into our concept development, and we may have a sort of a logical structure that differs from that requirement structure. When we go to actually build the CAD, you know, engineering is going to build their EBOM or their engineering bill of materials, again, based on design intent, based on grouping things logically for how you want to design that and how you're going to make changes to it in the future. You know, as we go on, what we want to be able to do is track, you know, how these different bill of materials are sort of related to each other. What part from an upstream BOM represents what part in a downstream BOM, what parts are only represented in a specific view of that BOM. And so this is what, you know, view versions allows us to do. So if you can look at it here, you know, a lot of times the two most common in the out-of-the-box views that are available is design or EBOM and manufacturing or MBOM. And so, you know, our engineering structure shown here in white is going to be built in one way based on design intent. When we go to manufacture that, we may need to regroup those objects so that you know, it's grouped logically for manufacturing. And so I have an example of this that I can show you as well. So let me jump back into Windchill. Oops. So here I'm in PTC Navigate. So this is Navigate View, which is sort of the new simplified interface that was released around the same time as Windchill 11, but it's also available in Windchill 10.2 if you're on the latest build. That allows me to go in and do things like view part structures. You know, so if I'm a user that's still run here, good. So if I'm a user that doesn't need full control over everything in Windchill, I just need to go in and occasionally view a part structure or search for a drawing or something like that. This gives me a simplified interface for doing this. And so I'm going to go in and look for my specific part structure, which is 4812. And so that found my 4812 assembly, which is my engine assembly, and it actually found two versions of it. It found an E-BOM version of it, that's my engineering BOM, and it also found an M-BOM version of that. So that is, two views of essentially the same thing. So I'm going to go in and look at my E-BOM version of that item. And so I can go in and see, for example, I have a connecting rod here. It highlights over in the structure. So I've got my piston assembly. That's made up of a pin, a ring, and the piston itself. Got my engine bearings, got my engine blocks. And again, if I look at the connecting rod that's inside of there, I may want to go view that in more detail. I'm going to click on the number up here. And I can see that the way this connecting rod was built for engineering in my E-BOM is that I have this connecting rod base, I have the main connecting rod component, and then I have two bolts holding that together. And it makes sense from a CAD design and an engineering perspective. All of this functions together, so we're going to group it together into a subassembly. But when I go to manufacture it, I can't put this whole thing together and then get it onto the rest of the engine, because I have to put it onto the crankshaft and then put the other side on and bolt it together. So that's where I want to create a different view of this bill of material that accurately reflects the fact that manufacturing is going to need to treat this connecting rod differently than engineering treated it for design intent purposes. So I'm going to exit out of, now I need to go and actually make changes. So I'm going to move out of PTC Navigate and jump back to my full Windchill interface. And again, you can see here I'm viewing the E-BOM version of this part. And I can go into my structure. And if I turn on my full structure here, I can see there's my entire engine assembly. But I can also go and turn everything off except for like the connecting rod and the crank. And you can see the issue that I would run into in manufacturing if I try to leave this connecting rod as all one component there. I need to break that up into separate pieces from a manufacturing perspective. So what I can do, if I go to my connecting rod and view its information page, if I want to change the structure of the actual connecting rod assembly, what I would do is from the connecting rod, I can choose Actions, New, and I can choose New View Version. And so the View version is going to allow me to define what view of this BOM I'm going to have. So again, it started out E-BOM was the default. I can create an M-BOM view from that, or I can create a service view from that. The default out-of-the-box views that are available are design and manufacturing, but that's totally configurable. You can go in and define whatever views you want. You can define them in a hierarchy. So I could have, if I have 3 different manufacturing plants, under M-BOM, I could have plant 1, plant 2, and plant 3. I'd have to create my M-BOM view first, and from that M-BOM view, I could create those further downstream views. So I'm not going to do that. I don't actually want a M-BOM view of the connecting rod. What I'm going to do is at my engine assembly level, I want to take the components of that connecting rod, and I just want to move them up to the top level in this case. So, for structural purposes on engineering, we have those grouped together into a subassembly. But when I go to manufacturing, I'm going to drop that subassembly and move those to the top level. Now, I can do that within just basic Windchill PDM links by creating, my manufacturing, my MBOB view of my top level assembly, and then manually restructuring things there. What I lose is some great tools for tracking what's used upstream and what's used downstream and making sure I've accounted for everything. So it can get confusing trying to do that within core PDM links. The PTC product that allows you to really do this, especially if you want to do things like I showed in the overheads where you have like 6 different views of the BOM that we're going to go through over time, is NPM link BOM management. So there's an NPM link BOM management package that you can add on to Windchill that will allow me to open this structure in what we call the Manufacturing Associative Part Structure Browser. Nice simple name. And when I open that, it's going to bring up this 2-sided HTML interface. And this is something prior to Windchill 11, the only way to do these types of things was through a Java-based product structure explorer. So they've really put a lot of work into this in Windchill 11 to make it just standard web-based. Doesn't matter if you have the right version of Java installed or anything like that. But what you can see here is on the left, it's showing the EBOM of my engine, and on the right, it's showing the MBOM of the engine. And the check marks indicate that there is an equivalent part on the downstream version of that. And if I'm not sure where that is, I can select here, look at my connecting rod. I can right-click, and I can tell it to select the equivalent part on the other side. And it's going to highlight it over here. And in here, I can actually go in, I can visualize these different versions of the BOM. So I can actually see what those are going to look like. And I have some tools to do comparisons between them. So this is where what I really want to be able to do is see everything that was in my engineering BOM, did I account for that in the manufacturing BOM, or did I leave something out? Do the quantities match? If I'm moving things from a subassembly and there's multiple instances of that subassembly in there, if I had 2 instances in the subassembly and 2 instances of the subassembly, if I move those to the top level, did I remember to make my quantity 4 at the top level instead of 2 like it was in the subassembly? And so I have this tool here to do a reconciliation between these 2 versions of the BOM. And that flies out this side panel. And in the side panel, I can now go in and tell it, do I just want to compare quantity or do I want to compare all criteria? And I can tell it whether or not to worry about downstream parts that have no upstream equivalence and whether or not to worry about intermediate subassemblies. So I'm going to tell it to check as much as it can, and I'm going to do a search, top level. And it's going to tell me that it found discrepancies, and it's going to highlight those items. And so if I go in and look at this item here, you can see it has a little yellow triangle. It indicates an equivalent part does not exist on any iteration of the upstream BOM. And so that's a support that we're using for manufacturing purposes. That's actually like a, sort of a fixture that we're using to actually assemble things. And so it makes sense that that exists in the MBOM but not the EBOM. That's why we have this option not to highlight downstream parts. And so if I do another search with that checked, whoops, I have to actually pick my top level item. If I do another search with that checked, now you can see it didn't highlight that support component down at the bottom because it wasn't looking for whether we had things in the manufacturing BOM that weren't in the EBOM. It still highlighted this item, and if I go to my attributes for that item, and again I can go in, I can tell it to show the equivalent part on the other side, look at its attributes. I can see I had 3 of that particular bolt in the EBOM, and for some reason I have 4 in the MBOM. So that's the issue there, is I just put too many of those bolts in here. And so I can come in, just modify that quantity, and check this back in. Now if I go back and run that same search again, and now it tells me no discrepancies were found. Now my upstream and downstream quantities match, and so everything is good. So those types of things, again, I can build this EBOM, just a basic PDM link, but to do this type of sort of reconciliation and checking to make sure all my quantities and everything match up, that capability needs this npm link BOM management functionality. Okay, let me close out of my side panel and make the change that we were talking about before, which was, basically I want to take the components that are in my connecting rod assembly, and I'll highlight my connecting rod on the other side. I want to take those components and just move them to the top level in the MBOM and basically remove the connecting rod from that downstream BOM. And so I can do that right in here. I can select those 3 components from my EBOM. I can copy them. I can select my top level, and I can paste them. And so there, now I've got these 3 components in my MBOM, and having done that, I also want to remember, because if I do a reconciliation now, it's going to tell me the quantities of the connecting rod components don't match up because I got 2 of them over in my MBOM. So I'm going to go pick just the connecting rod itself, this one. And I'm going to remove that from the structure. And again, I'll go ahead and check this back in. And now if I do my reconciliation, what it will find is the wrong thing. No. What it will find now is it will highlight my connecting rod assembly. If I tell it do not highlight, if I don't tell it to ignore intermediate subassemblies, it's going to tell me, hey, this connecting rod has no equivalent object on the other side. In this case, if I'm not worried about, oh, do my subassemblies match up, what I'm concerned about is all my bottom level individual components, have I accounted for all of those? That's why I can tell it don't highlight the intermediate subassemblies. So now I'll do a search again. Oh. I have to tell it to search the right thing. And now it says no discrepancies found. So now, I don't care that this connecting rod assembly doesn't exist in the MBOM because I took all of its components and I moved that up to the top level. And as you do more and more restructuring, you can see how it becomes more important to be able to select something and say, okay, show me where does this exist on the other side. Okay, there's where it exists on the other side because it's not in that same subassembly anymore. So again, that's sort of the second way that you can be concerned with product structure management is, okay, now we're not so much worried about how the structure is changing over time. We're worried about doing BOM transformation so that we're viewing the BOM structured in the right way that we need it to do our job. Engineering needs to see it structured one way. Manufacturing needs to see it structured another way. Purchasing may need to see it structured another way. Service may need to see it structured another way. And so we're doing that BOM transformation. The third sort of category of product structure management that I wanted to look at was configurable products. So, you know, support for assemble to order or configure to order or engineer to order. You know, when you go to buy a new laptop on Dell's website, you pick sort of the base laptop you want, and then you can go through and choose one of several different processors. You can choose different amounts of RAM that you want to put in. You can choose the backlit keyboard or the non-backlit keyboard. You know, we don't know all of the different possible configurations. Maybe there's 50,000 possible configurations you could get by choosing those different options. We don't want to think through all of those ahead of time and create a new part number for each of those. We want to have the ability to basically define what the options are and, you know, sort of choose the options on the fly and create the new part number as we need it. And so that's what we can do with options and variants in Windchill. And options and variants is supported in PDM-Link. It's something that you need to enable through your preferences. You have to go in and enable you know, your options and variants in your preferences. And go to, I'm going to go to option test here. So here's an example of you know, using options and variants. And so essentially what we do is I have a configurable product. And this is a real simple example again, where I can define that I have a part that is going to be configurable. So I'm going to have different things swap in and out within that configurable module. And then I build an overloaded BOM. And so I'm going to have this one option where I can choose choice A or choice B, and then I'm going to have another option where I can choose choice 1 or choice 2. If I look at my visualization here, you know, I basically have a block with another block assembled into it. The inner block is this first, or is option 2. So I have a circular version and I have a square version. And then the channel that it's assembled into, I have a full channel and I just have an L channel. And so again, I can use any of these combinations. I can use the U channel with the square, U channel with the circle, L channel with the square, L channel with the circle. But again, as I add more things in here, you know, it's going to keep increasing the number of options, and I don't want to think through all of those possibilities. So again, once I've enabled options and variants in my preferences, then in the details page for the product, I'm able to go in and define my option pool. And so here are all the different options I could potentially select. And so I have a bunch of different options here that some of them apply to this assembly, some of them apply to different assemblies. And then within each option, I can define what choices are going to be available. Now in this case, I just have 2 choices for each one, but I could have 30 choices for each of these if I wanted to. So the 2 that we're looking at right now are option 1 and option 2. Option 1, choice 1 and choice 2. Option 2, choice A and choice B. So I build that up. I can combine those into option sets. And within the option sets, I can specify which of these options are available in that set. I can have include and exclude rules. So I can basically say if I choose one option or one choice for one of the options, automatically force me to choose something for a different option or prevent me from choosing other options. You know, sometimes if I choose a lower level processor for my computer, I'm not going to be able to have as much RAM. So it may limit me on the number of options that I choose there. If I choose a smaller chassis, maybe I can only put 1 hard drive in it instead of 2 hard drives. So I can go in and build some of that logic in there as well. And then I can essentially choose which of these option sets is active. And so when I go to my structure, again, I've built this overloaded BOM. And once I've built that overloaded BOM, now I can go in and assign those choices that I've defined to the components with the BOM. So you can see for option 2, choice A is the square component, choice B is the round, choice 1 is the L channel, choice 2 is the U channel. And so now I can go through and sort of configure variations of this on the fly. And there are a couple ways I can do that. One is maybe I just want to test this configuration. So instead of going in and actually building a new configuration, I'm going to just edit my filter like we looked at earlier. But now instead of specifying the configuration specification like we did earlier with the baselines, I'm going to configure my option filter. And so here are all the options that we have active. So for option 1, I'm going to choose choice 1. And option 2, I'm going to choose choice B. And I've got the L and the circle there. Maybe I decide, you know what, I actually wanted the U and the circle. So that's going to be choice 2 instead of choice 1. So I'm going to edit my filter. And so I'm going to leave choice B, but I'm going to change this to choice 2. And now that updates. I can even select it from my structure tree, and I can tell it to open that in Creo view. And it's going to launch me into Creo view with that configured version of the product that now I can go in and use Creo view's measurement tools and markup and annotation and interference checking to go in and make sure that that is a, sort of a valid configuration that I've set up. Now the other thing I can do is once I'm going to set my filter back to the default, it's going to pull me back to my configured product. I can also go in now and I can tell it I want to configure an instance of this. And so that's going to allow me to set up my configuration specification. I'm going to go through my option filter. So for option 1, I'm going to choose choice 1. For option 2, I'm going to choose, actually I'm going to do choice 2 and choice B, which I think is what we just looked at. I can also have parameters that I can define within that, that variable structure. In this case, I don't have any set up, but it's going to show me a preview of which of each of these it's selected. So it previews my structure that I'm going to end up with. And it tells me, hey, I actually already have a matching variant specification. I've configured this configuration before, and so I can tell it, okay, I'm just going to use that existing variant specification. And then it can build a module variant. So even though I've configured that specification, I don't have an actual module built out of it, so it's going to create a new one. So the variant specification is the rules. Okay, for choice 2, or for option 1, I chose choice 2. For option 2, I chose choice B. And then it's going to generate a bill of materials based off of that. And it creates this deliverable. So it created a new part number for me. And if I go view that information, you can see it took that overstuffed bill of material that I started with, and it configured, just what I wanted out of that, and created a new part number that gives me all of that. Now, if I went back and reconfigured the same thing right now, it's going to see, okay, not only does a variant specification exist, but there's also a configured module that also exists, and it's just going to let me reuse this one. I don't have to create a new one every time because it already exists. And there's a bunch of other things you can do with this. I can define these configurable modules that we have in here. So like if I go look at this module, if I actually want that to disappear when I configure this and just take my choice and move it up to the top level, I can actually do that. If I go to my common attributes, I can go in and tell it that's going to be collapsible. So if I make that collapsible, now when I choose choice B, instead of leaving the subassembly here, it's going to move my part up to the top level, so it's going to simplify my structure for me. So there's additional things that you can do like that just to keep things as sort of easy to manage as possible. And then from here, I can go in and I can add my tab to my assembly that's going to show here are all of the different variant specifications that have been configured, and here are the module variants. And so, again, if I look at one of these, I'm going to see that's the L and the circle. If I had gone through and configured, okay, give me the L channel and the circular part, it's going to come up and say, hey, not only does that variant specification exist, an actual configured module or a configured variation exists, and it's just going to allow me to come right to the details page. I don't have to build a new part number to keep recreating the same thing over and over and over again. So again, all of that capability, it's available just in core PDM link. There's a preference you have to use to turn it on, and then it's a matter of setting up all the options that you want and going through and assigning those to the different parts within your BOM. So I think we are pretty much out of time, and that's again, that's essentially the everything that I wanted to go through there. One of the things that I will point out is when we talk about okay, we have product structure management and change management. The Windchill change management tools will apply to all of these things that we talked about. So even like my options sets, these items, these option sets have a version and a lifecycle state, so I can go in and create problem reports and change requests and change notices if I need to change the options that are available. So it's not just, oh, I need to make a change to this specific assembly. If we're using some of these product structure management tools, if we're using options and variants, I can now take all of those change management capabilities and I can also apply them to my actual option sets and what choices we're making, as well as to the actual finally configured products. So that's all that I had for you guys. If you have any questions, again, you're still currently muted, but if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the questions panel, and I will try to answer those as they come in. There's also some way you're supposed to be able to raise your hands in there. If you click the raise hand button, I'll see those and I can unmute you to ask a question. In the meantime, I will leave the contact information up here if you want to write that down. And thank you very much for joining us on the webinar. All right, it doesn't look like anybody has any questions, and everyone is dropping out at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar at this point. If you do have questions that you think of afterwards, please email us at the address is shown on the slide here.